You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is a solved case of the $1 million serial killer next door. Now, this was a house that involved a whole family of business owners, small children. How could this have gone wrong? And why were people so blind not to be able to see it? There's two cases, a possible connection, and an unknown amount of victims. This is a case that technically can't be solved, but it is in a way. That'll be explained further in the case. But by the way, if you don't know, it's my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean absolutely no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something that you would like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. I also want to say, if any of you are interested in ASMR, I get lots of questions to either start a channel or that you think my voice sounds like it, which thank you so much for all of the compliments. But I did start an ASMR channel, and it's called Genuine Gem ASMR, and it is always linked down in the description if that's something that interests you or if you just want to try it out. A lot of people say that it helps with their anxiety during this time, and that's why I've kind of been posting a lot more on there too. So if you want to, you can check it out. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1994 in Indiana, and men in Indianapolis started going missing. There was actually a retired detective or retired sheriff who had started his own private investigative firm, and so he would often get calls from different people. He could never really expect where they were coming from or who they were going to be, but they were different individuals who were wanting his service and helping find something that was wrong with their family, whether that was a missing person, whether that was a suspicious person or a murder, anything like that, or just if people didn't believe the police were doing a good enough job. And so he, that year, would get a call that June, and this was from a woman whose son had vanished from a bar called Brothers in the area. This was on June 6th that he vanished. He was 28 years old. Everything was perfectly normal up until that day where he just disappeared, and nobody was helping her in his case. And so she came to this private detective who was named Virgil. The missing man's name was Alan Wayne Broussard, and he was well known in the area as being missing. However, that was just to the community. It wasn't to the media. It wasn't to even really the police. It was just people who knew him around the area and loved him. Virgil said he would definitely help out in finding Alan and told his mother not to worry before they hung up. However, he would soon then get a call from another mother. This other mother claimed her son had also disappeared when he went out to the bars on July 22nd and had not been seen since. It was sort of the same MO as Alan. His name was Roger Allen Goodlett, and he was 33 years old, and his mother Catherine said that he had been with her earlier that day. Everything was normal. He had actually come over to help her make a bench for her backyard, and they worked really well together. They worked quickly, they got it up, and then he decided to take some pictures. He loved photography, and so he wanted to take some pictures of his mother in the garden where he thought that she looked really beautiful, as well as some of the blooming flowers, because it was, in the middle of summer. And that evening he said that he was going to go out and go bar hopping, as he often did. He loved going to the clubs, and he got all dressed up and left, and he took the bus there, but he didn't take the bus back, and he didn't get a ride back either. Around the same time, Virgil also got a call from a magazine in the area, and they were wanting help because they had been contacted about different missing men who were just vanishing in the area, who all kind of had that same thing happening to them. And of course, being a magazine editor, publisher, whatever they were, they couldn't do much about it, and so they were hoping that Virgil could. And after hearing all of this, he knew that something more was going on here. It couldn't just be some strange coincidence, could it? Well, he decided to take it into his own hands, and he started going to these different bars that these men were disappearing from. and he would just kind of watch people, see if he saw anything out of the ordinary, anyone out of the ordinary, and he also started talking to people. You know, he was just making casual conversation, seeing if they knew any of these victims or had seen them that night. He would quickly learn that these two cases of Alan and of Roger were not uncommon, because many people knew of many different names of men who had gone missing as well. As Virgil started piecing all of this together, he realized that this could have possibly started a year prior, in 1993. Now, the MO was a bit different on some of these cases, but they were all around the same age and they looked the same. They were all white males with dark hair, or at least, you know, a lighter skin tone with dark hair. And so he started kind of collecting all this information of these men going missing just in this area, and to see, you know, if he could connect them later on. And he came about a 20-year-old boy named Johnny Bayer, who had disappeared on May 28th of 1993 as he was going to his job at McDonald's. He walked there and he never made it to his shift. Then about a month later, in July, a 30-year-old named Jeff Jones was actually last seen coming out of a Salvation Army rehab center, never to be seen again. They're not sure if he got a ride home or if he simply just went missing from there, possibly had an accident of some sort, but he really just got out of rehab and vanished. And then that same month, it was July 31st, and 20-year-old Robert Hamilton had left his apartment around 2 a.m. to go and buy some cigarettes. This was pretty normal for him to go out and about in the middle of the night. It really didn't bother him much, but at this point he didn't return home and nobody knew why. About a week later, on August 7th, a man named Alan Livingston, who was 28, had been seen getting into a white car and vanishing. That same night, a man named Manuel Resendez, who was 31 years old, vanished as well. He was out clubbing with his friends, and when they tried to find him when they were ready to leave, he was nowhere inside of any of these clubs. These were 5 more victims that were possibly connected to the 2 that Virgil had already been informed about. However, these had started back in, you know, the last year, and they had ended that August, and that was when Manuel had disappeared. However, when Alan and when Roger disappeared the next year, it would be 11 months later. So we couldn't be certain that, you know, this certain killer or abductor, whatever they were, had wanted to wait that long, had possibly left the area. Different circumstances had stopped them from doing this for 11 months, or if possibly it was 2 different people entirely. Virgil, the private detective, knew that there was something more going on here, so he did what anyone would do. He took it to the police to say that he needed more help and that this was something that they should be aware about as well. And they pretty much shrugged their shoulders and were not too eager to do anything. And there are reasonings why it said they did this, which we will get into a bit later, but at that moment, they weren't going to help him, so Virgil took it into his own hands and he began to interview witnesses at these bars who had either seen these missing men the night that they went missing or just frequented the bars and kind of knew everybody that came and went. He was putting up missing persons posters as well that were, you know, in clear view from where everybody had to walk to get their drinks. He also found a man who was a good friend with Roger Goodlet, one of the main men that Virgil was supposed to be looking into their disappearances because his mother had called him. And this friend of Roger said that the day he went missing, he had actually seen him getting into a blue car with Ohio license plate. And he had kind of called out to Roger just to say hey, because he had seen a friend, and just kind of waved at him, and Roger waved back like it wasn't any big deal, like nothing was wrong, and got into the car and they sped away. And little did he know that's the last time anybody would see Roger at all. Not only were the police in this area unwilling to look into these cases, but the media was unwilling as well, unwilling to post about it, to research it, to even acknowledge it. And the thing was, that meant that there were very few eyes who actually knew what happened besides the people who knew these victims. And with nobody looking for a killer, there would be more disappearances. This time, it was only days after Roger had disappeared, and it was a 26-year-old named Stephen Hale who was at a central library, simply just going to a peacefully quiet area to read and do some work on the computer, and his life was snatched away from him. Unfortunately, at this point, nothing truly connected the victims because there weren't even crime scenes to say that it was a crime. And this was the biggest problem because a lot of people started to say possibly they were runaways because their lifestyle didn't fit around this area, so maybe they just wanted to go to an area they fit in. And that was because if you would look closer, beyond the fact that these men looked the same, had the same height, weight, hair color, they had quite a bit in common. They also loved going to gay bars. All of these men were thought to be in the LGBTQ+ community. They were either in the community or they just supported it and loved going to these bars and had friends who were in the community, but regardless, they all hung out in these areas. And that is ultimately why no one wanted to help with their cases. They all just said that their gay lifestyle meant that they ran away because nobody accepted them there. But instead of, teaching people that you should accept people everywhere, they said that it was probably a good idea that they went to another place. Virgil had been going through all the different, interviews that he had done and all the information he had, and he also looked into the little information that the police had on all of these. But that's when he found that in August of 1994, because he was now working on the investigation for months, in August of 1994 a man had called the police. His name was Tony Harris, or at least that's what he went by for quite a long time in the media because he didn't want to be known to the public for what his real name was. And he had said that he was friends with Roger Goodlett and that he often frequented the same bars that Roger did. Tony said that he had met this man at one of these bars named Brian Smart, and they hit it off pretty quickly. They were drinking together, they were talking a lot, and then this man asked Tony if he wanted to go back to his employer's home. And this was because he was a construction worker, or so he said, and he was currently living at his employer's home while they were away to do some work. And Tony said yes, and so they got into his vehicle, which had Ohio license plate. And he drove about 30 minutes north to this home. Tony said that he was pretty drunk at this point, but he did notice how huge the home was. It had a pool in the back, but there were also some very strange, alarming things. He said when they got to the pool, there were mannequins dressed up, sitting along the edge of the pool and around it, as though there was a pool party happening with mannequins, like little kids play with their Barbie dolls. When Tony asked what these were for, this man Brian said that basically his employer got lonely, and this is how he dealt with it. But Tony was kind of freaked out by this point, and when Brian handed him another drink or offered him one, he declined. And that's when Brian kind of got right to it and told Tony about his interest in erotic asphyxiation, which, if you don't know, is like the pleasure of being choked or of a lack of supply of air. And, he offered Tony to help him out with this and to basically choke him. And Tony did so, and he kind of passed out for a moment, kind of fell into the pool, and he came back to a few minutes later. And he was really excited at this point and asked Tony if he wanted to switch. This began on Tony, and he said that's when he realized that Brian's grasp was getting tighter and tighter, and he wasn't letting up. Tony couldn't breathe. He was being strangled to death. The only thing that Tony could think of to do was to pass out. He really had a fighter's instinct when it came to fight or flight or freeze or fawn. And he passed out, or seemed to, and Brian let go of him. And at this point, he waited a moment and pretended to come back, to life, to breathe again. And Brian was looking at him so shocked because he believed he had killed him. And so after this, Brian had kind of tried to make fun of the whole situation, and he offered to give Tony a ride back home, and then he said that they could do it again. And Tony said, yeah, that'd be fine, and they actually planned to meet up again later, but Brian never showed up. The police said thankfully kept a record of this and told Tony that if he ever came in contact with Brian Smart again, to let them know. And unfortunately, he had not yet seen him again. He had just kind of vanished from the area in these bars, and so they didn't have much more to go on, but Virgil knew in his gut that something was wrong with this Brian guy. That, first of all, Brian was probably not his name, and secondly, that he was probably a killer, a serial killer, and they needed to do whatever they could to find him before he struck again. Now, Virgil contacted Tony and asked him if he could get the story once again, and just if he had any more information. And Tony began to tell him that he did have more information than that was on the report, but the police really didn't do anything with it and didn't want to hear what he had to say. So Virgil said, I'm all ears, and Tony began to tell him the full story. That's when Tony would say that he didn't just randomly run into this Brian and they hit it off. That Brian was looking at the missing persons posters that Virgil had put up on the wall. And the way he was looking at them made Tony just feel like he had to talk to him, because there was just an eerie feeling that he knew more than what anybody knew, and that he could possibly know where Roger was. So Tony, being Roger's friend, started talking to him. And as the night progressed, he did enjoy his company, but he still had this feeling in the back of his head that he had something to do with all of these disappearances. Tony said that he had actually seen the man named Brian before in these bars. However, he always looked very uncomfortable. He always came by himself. He seemed to leave by himself, and there really just wasn't much that anybody knew about him when he was coming to these bars. Even though it was kind of like a big family that everyone normally talked to one another, nobody really knew Brian. And so they were making small talk. Brian said he was a landscaper from Ohio, and that is when Tony decided to bring up Roger, just to ask and see how this man reacted. And that is when he really did just try to avoid the conversation entirely. He did act as though he was concerned about the fact that Roger was missing. However, Tony could just tell it wasn't genuine, and it was very obvious. And that is when they went back to Brian's home, and he said that he remembers going by large houses, horse ranches, a spit rail fence, and a sign that read farm on the front. And he remembers that it was there right before they turned into the driveway of this house. Tony said he was much larger than Brian, which is why he believes that he survived. Now, he also said that Brian kind of told him that he loved the feeling of watching somebody's eyes bulge out when you were strangling them, and their skin become discolored, and their lips cracking. And he was just going on and on about these details about the strangulation that he enjoyed, rather than just the, sexual aspect of it. Tony then began to really get creeped out, and he told Brian, I'm going to go to police with all of this. And Brian simply told him, no one's going to believe a man like you. And unfortunately, they may have believed him, but they didn't do anything about it. Virgil knew in his gut that Brian was the guy, that they really had caught him, in essence. They just needed to find him. So they decided to contact a detective at the police department that Virgil was still in contact with, and she was actually the one to take Tony out around this area, around the wealthy homes, to see if he could identify which direction they went in to possibly nail down a location. However, they went a few times and they just weren't finding it at all. They went at night, they went during different seasons, they went during the day, but nothing was leading them to this home. All these missing persons cases were left unsolved for years, and the families would call to investigators seeing if they had any leads, but everything really did seem to be a dead end. FBI profilers said that this man was most likely white, in his mid-40s, and who was bisexual and also had an above average IQ. Now, this isn't the last time that the police and Virgil heard from Tony, because he would start getting frequent calls from this Brian guy saying that he wanted to see him again, that he wanted to, reenact the experience they had that previous night. Brian was also saying that he was experienced with death or familiar with it, and that he had experience in accidents, which ultimately could have been what happened to all of these men. They just weren't sure yet. Eventually, during all of these calls, police attempted to trace it. However, because during this time he was using a cell phone, it was not traceable with the technology they had. Now, I'm sure that this is where you all believed and hoped that the victim list would end. But unfortunately, we are not done yet, because a year after Roger's disappearance, and 2 years after this all was thought to have started, another man went missing. This was on April 1st, and 46-year-old Michael Keyern would disappear between going from his home to his factory job. 5 months after this, 35-year-old Jerry Comer went to a shopping mall and simply did not return home, and also didn't go for his car because his car was still in the parking lot. There were now 10 men who were missing without a trace. Then that same year of 1995, they would get a huge break, because Tony would contact them again. He had gone on to live his normal life. He was going to these bars again, and that August he had run into Brian Smart. As soon as he saw him, he had a friend run outside, look for his vehicle, and write down the license plate number. When he got the license plate number, he sent it to police, and they would trace it. They had him. Or did they? This trace led them to a man named Herbert Baumeister, and he was an average father and businessman, an owner of a business, and husband. And he was a typical suburban guy that was loved by all of his neighbors. He lived in the small town of Westfield in a $1 million home with 18 acres. Could this really be the killer they were looking for? When detectives went to Herbert's business to talk to him, he appeared instantly nervous, and all they did was ask him if he went to some gay bars, and he was instantly denying all of this. And they said, "Look, we have you placed at these gay bars, so we know you were there." And that's when Herbert said that basically he was all nervous because his family didn't know that he went there, and he didn't want them to find out. But then they asked Herbert if they could search his home, and he denied this, saying that they would have to go through a lawyer next time. So investigators then decided that they would be going through someone else, his wife, Julie, to see if they could get her to budge, since he wouldn't. They told Julie that her husband was being looked into for homosexual homicide, and she said she didn't even really know what that was. She knew the two different words, but together it didn't make sense to her. And hearing all of this, she said her body just went blank, and she just wanted investigators to leave so she could cry. They left, and she ended up calling back a little while later, explaining to them that her husband wasn't a killer, that he had never even raised his voice at her. He never so much as bruised her, and he definitely did not harm any of their kids. So they were not going to be allowed on their property because her husband did not do it. And she said if they wanted to come, they would need a search warrant. Now, she also said she had talked to Herbert about this, and he had denied having to do with anything. They had tried to get a search warrant, however, they had such little evidence at this point that they were back to square one. But they weren't just going to sit there and do nothing, and so they decided to kind of weasel their way around it, to find a loophole. And they decided to take a helicopter and go over this 18-acre land with an infrared camera that could detect body heat from a possible, decaying corpse. And unfortunately or fortunately, they didn't find anything that picked up on this camera. And so they just didn't have anything once again to go on to get an actual search warrant. They did see that at the entrance of their property there was a huge sign saying Fox Hollow Farm. And Julie and Herbert had a lawyer themselves who kept in contact with detectives, telling them not to give up on their investigation. The lawyers of the ones being accused was saying, don't give up, to the investigators. They knew that this lawyer knew something, so they weren't going to give it up. The next year, around June of 1996, Julie would actually come to them. She was saying that Herbert had had a nervous breakdown and had closed one of their stores that they owned and had taken their son, Eric, to Lake Wawasee, where his own mother lived. And she had no idea why he was doing this. They hadn't talked about it, but she was terrified of her husband's mental stability and wanted their help. She said that they'd actually filed for divorce months earlier. They hadn't spent that previous Christmas together, and they were having a lot of marital and family problems. Financial distress was happening in the home due to, the actual home mortgage as well as the store and how it was sort of failing at this time. You see, Herbert and Julie had met in college at Indiana University when they were preparing their sports team for the Rose Bowl. And they quickly became friends just because they loved spending time together. Julie said that Herbert was someone that was so fun to be around, and they just kept in contact through there and had a relationship. And they would get married after Julie graduated because Herbert had actually dropped out, even though he was going to school to become a doctor. However, 6 months into their marriage, Herbert actually was put into a psychiatric hospital. And it's unknown why. However, his father committed him, and Julie had said that he was hurting and needed help. The couple ended up having 3 children together, Marie, Eric, and Emily. And after Herbert went through many jobs, getting fired from most of them, they actually decided to start up a thrift store. Now, his parents were pretty well off, and his mother gave him a loan to start this. It was called Save a Lot, and it, just had all of the different consignment type things there to purchase for a cheaper price that were used or gently used. It became pretty successful. They were also trying to be hands-on parents, and they would send their kids to private school as well. And during the summers, their mother would take them to the lake while their father stayed and took care of the store so that the kids could still get a vacation. Now, at this point, Herbert and Julie had enough money to buy a house, and they found one that was pretty secluded, far out in the woods, that had plenty of land and was $1 million. But they thought it was perfect. It was a suburb. It was great for kids to be able to run and be active and just have fun. Julie could have never known what her kids would find on that property years later, because then Julie would tell investigators a story she had never told before. That in 1994, 2 years prior, 1 year into these murders, 2 years into these murders, her children had found a skull in the backyard when they were playing. And she didn't believe them until she came out to see it herself, and she found basically a full-on skeleton laying half buried in the ground. Julie had brought this up to Herbert and, said, how is this possible? And Herbert had said, oh, it's fake. It's one of my dad's, because his dad was a doctor. It's one of my dad's old skeletons that he used to study and practice medicine. Just one of those fake ones. And so Julie said, oh, okay, that makes sense, even though why would he have buried it in the yard? But she let it go from there. And at this point, Julie said, I'm ready for you guys to search the property and tell me if it was real or not. And when they did, they quickly realized that it was in fact human remains, and they began their search while Herbert was away on vacation with their son. All 18 acres were thoroughly excavated, and they found as many as 15,000 teeth and bone fragments, and even found some on the neighbor's land. And they had so much land already. There were thought to be 11 different men that they found the body parts for. However, we only know about 10 victims. So who was that last man? Well, it was actually found that they could only identify, out of the victims we knew, 8 men. So there were actually still 3 men that were unidentified. But the 8 men who were identified were Roger Goodlett, Stephen Hale, Richard Hamilton, Manuel Resendez, Mike Kearn, Johnny Bayer, Alan Broussard, and Jeff Jones. However, Alan Livingston and Jerry Comer were not found, and that meant the 3 were still unidentified. Herbert, the serial killer, had been caught. Now he just needed to be found. He was still on vacation with his son, and Julie was panicking at this point, thinking that he was going to harm Eric. And so the investigators decided to keep all of this under wraps, what they had found. They kept it out of the media because this was such a secluded area. Nobody in the media had really heard about it yet. So they decided to go to Herbert with custody papers. This said that he needed to give Eric up to Julie for a while. And thankfully they went where he was. They got Eric out safely. They decided to get him back home, and then they were going to go back for Herbert. And that meant they were letting him go free without a child to hold him back. The news about this serial killer and these missing men being found in his backyard aired, and now he was nowhere to be found. And they would need to start a search to look for him. Something you should know about Herbert is that he had a reputation for being quite strange. He had a pretty normal childhood. I mean, his parents had money. He was the oldest of 4 children, and there was nothing strange that really happened. However, as a child, he started experiencing very strange behaviors, and he often peed in random places, like on his teacher's desk. He was said to talk back to his teachers and harm them. And he also was obsessed with death and animals. He would play with dead animals and keep them in his pockets. There was a dead crow that he just picked up and carried around like it was a friend. When he was a teen, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder, or being a sociopath. And as he got older and went on to different jobs, he actually urinated on lots of different things. There was a note that was meant to go to the governor at one of his jobs that he decided to pee on. There was a supervisor's desk, and he often also said that he wondered what urine would taste like. During this time, he committed a hit and run while intoxicated, and the next year he was charged with auto theft and the conspiracy to commit theft. Now, everything pretty much settled down when they decided to open up their thrift store. But this was only for a while. What Julie didn't know was that when she would be out of town, whether that was with kids or for business, her husband was out going to these gay bars and picking up men and killing them. He would invite them back to their house, slip them drugs, and strangle them and burn and bury them on their property where their kids lived and played. Julie did, however, know and tell investigators that they had only ever been intimate 6 times. They had 3 children, so thankfully, 3 of those times were successful since Julie wanted kids. But she said that only 6 times in their entire marriage had they been intimate. Those who knew him said that you didn't really see any of these monstrous behaviors at all. You noticed he was strange. You kind of got an eerie feeling around him, but there wasn't anything scary at all. Except for now that we know what we do. Now Herb was gone, not even contacting his wife or his children, and on the 4th of July of 1996, Julie would be told that her husband had been found. However, he was not being brought into custody because he was dead. He had been found in Ontario, Canada, in a car with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Beside him was a .357 caliber revolver, as well as 3 pages of a suicide note that mentioned his failing businesses and failing marriage, and basically said that's why he took his life. And at this point, he also said he was sorry he messed up the park, that he was going to eat his peanut butter sandwich and then go to sleep. Even in death, he would refuse to admit what he had done, or at least why there were 11 bodies in his backyard. And, you know, these murders were thought to be solved, but technically nobody had ever been found guilty in the Fox Hollow Farm murders. Media outlets covered this story in favor of the killer, which baffled some, but unfortunately not enough to make it known that this was not okay. You know, they were saying that Herbert was a troubled man, and that the victims, you know, basically were either prostitutes or that they were gay, and kind of they looked down upon the victims for those things, like it didn't matter that they had been brutally murdered. And this is ultimately why I don't know a lot about a lot of these victims. You guys know how much I think it's important to tell the victim story beyond who they were, you know, in death, or beyond their traumatic situation, who they were. And I couldn't for a lot of them because there is no information out there about them, because the media outlets decided to care more about the fact that Herbert might have been a troubled man. Yes, he was very troubled, but doesn't it matter more about the victims? Doesn't it matter that the man who took their lives took the easy way out so he didn't have to be punished for it? There was actually a sheriff down by where he took his life that said that he had seen him parked under a bridge and had gone up to him, and Herbert had just said that he was trying to rest there, and the sheriff had noticed a stack of tapes in the back of his car. However, when Herbert was found, these tapes were not, and it's thought that he discarded them, that they were possibly, you know, recordings of these murders, you know, the sexual aspect of them that he liked to keep. However, investigators began to suspect that these weren't the only people that Herbert had murdered, but they would need Julie's help in figuring out if they could connect him to it since he was gone. And that was because they had already cleared Julie of being an accomplice to the Fox Hollow Farm murders, because she had been away every single time that he had taken a victim. So they were all going to be looking into murders happening 10 years prior to all of this with the Fox Hollow Farm murders. This was between 1980 and 1990 when 9 young men were found alongside Interstate 70 between Indianapolis and Columbia, Ohio, which is a route that Herbert often took. Not only did these men fit Herbert's MO of being, you know, young white men who were gay, but they had also been strangled to death. Investigators had an eerie feeling that he was responsible for these, but it was Julie who said that he had driven that route about 100 times, and this was actually prior to them moving to their $1 million mansion. And strangely enough, when they moved to their $1 million mansion, those murders stopped and the Indianapolis murders at the bars started. Almost as if the killer had found a new location to bury his victims, in his own yard. The unknown killer was dubbed the I-70 Strangler until 1988. This was 2 years after Herbert was found to be a serial killer, and that is when a witness came forward saying that he had seen pictures of Herbert, and he recognized him for something other than the Fox Hollow Farm murders. And that was because this was the man that he had seen leaving a bar with a victim of the I-70 Strangler. His name was Michael Riley, and he ended up being found on Interstate 70 in a stream. And remember the man who survived a night with Herbert? Tony? Well, he said that Brian, who was Herbert, had told him that he killed as many as 50 to 60 people. And, I mean, this would still only get him, you know, up to the 20s. So there could be many more victims we have no idea about out there, and we probably never will. Now, Tony, who I said did not use his real name, eventually, after Herbert had been found dead, of course, he came out with his real name, which is Mike Goodyear. And he was the survivor. Now, as soon as he came out with his real name, Julie actually said that that name sounded really familiar, because Herbert had told her that Mike Goodyear is someone that they needed to watch out for, and that they also needed to be afraid of him. And Julie was terrified that her husband was saying they need to be afraid of anybody, Little did she know she needed to be afraid of her own husband. But he was the serial killer who lived next door, who seemed like the average suburban dad and husband. And Julie and her kids actually moved out of that house pretty soon after, and more people would move in. Now, in 2009, this new family moved in, and they knew what they were getting into. They knew what this house and the yard entailed, and the fact that they could probably find bones still to that day. However, they took a chance, and it was the Graves family, and they also rented an apartment on the land as well to another man named Joe. But Vicky would tell a story of a red-shirted man that she would often see walking her property. However, when she got closer, he had no legs and was floating. Now, at one point, this other person, Joe, that was living on their land, also saw this person, ran after them, and ultimately found a human femur who they took to the police station, and they said, "Thank you, this will probably happen a lot, unfortunately." But, if you believe in stuff like this, could this have possibly been a victim trying to tell them that their remains were still there? That just kind of makes me really sad, but in that case, at least a victim still had a final say in them being found or not. The real question is, did Herbert really kill all these people? He can't tell us. We can't even take him to trial to say if he did or not. And that's the most infuriating part. A lot of people say that his secret life, his double life, led from the fact that he was a gay man and that possibly he wasn't even bisexual. I, don't want to go into that because I think that's, kind of a personal thing even for a killer, and we can't label them what we want them to be, but some do say that possibly he was fully gay and that he wanted to get away from his wife and his normal life that he had to have, and so he created this not so normal life, and this ultimately caused him to get angry at these men who were able to live how they wanted, and so he started to take their lives. Maybe it was also speculated that it was more of an accident, that he didn't set out to kill, but that one of these times he was with these men and they were, doing the choking, that he did accidentally kill someone and he enjoyed it. I think this case is one of those that freaked me out the most because nobody expected it. Nobody would have believed it was him until they saw the bodies. That's just how good he was at having two faces. Do you believe Julie knew and was too scared to come forward, or do you really think that she was in utter shock when the police came to her that day? He was really good at manipulating her for many years, and she probably had no idea because he was so talented in keeping his two lives separate until a divorce threatened to take his normal life away. I think that's when he snapped. Well, snapped even more. I guess he was killing prior to that, but I think, to him, his nervous breakdown came about with the divorce because he knew he would need to find another way to remain normal. Which is sad in a way. It's sad for the victims. It's sad that he felt like he had to hide himself, but it doesn't excuse his behavior. It doesn't excuse what he did to other people. It just doesn't. But I do hope that I did the victims justice, even though I couldn't tell you a ton about them. They were living their lives. They were doing what they wanted to do, and they were having fun, most of them at these clubs that they loved to go to, many of them with friends, just hanging out and trying to have a good night that night with another man. And that is all I can tell you, unfortunately, and if you know more, please leave it down below for us to read. But I hope I still did their story justice and they still get a little bit of the exposure that they deserved, because when all this was happening, they definitely didn't. So, don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay? Bye!